speaker for this conference. You have a big challenge with a depleted audience. So Sebastian Schmidt-Roach is from the Red Sea Research Center here at KAUST, and he'll be giving us his perspective on coral reef restoring. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be here today as the last talk in the last session. It's a real pleasure to be invited to this exciting conference. I'm going to talk about robotics and how we can use robotics to address the global challenges that we have to restore corals. So I thought it's a good start for my presentation to ask an AI how an AI pictures a robot planting corals. So this is what DALL-E thinks about it. Yes, so this is an AI picturing what a robot would look planting corals. Yeah, so I think the reality may look just slightly different, but I think it's a good start. Briefly to myself, I'm a research scientist in Professor Carlo Stoate's lab. We founded in 2019 what's been called the Coral Hub, which was like a group that somewhat pioneered coral restoration in the kingdom with Professor Manuel Randa, Professor Charlotte Hauser, and others. So we were among the first to actually do coral restoration in the kingdom. And the group since then has developed different technologies and different approaches. We were also key in planning the big project in NEOM, the Shusha project, up to funding approval. So why do we care about corals and coral reefs in general? Well, many livelihoods actually depend directly on corals. And if we lose them, if we lose their functionality, these people will suffer, they will have a lack of income, and this will create big problems on a global scale. About 500 million people depend directly on corals. The problem is that we have lost around 30 to 50% since the mid of the last century. And if we look at some of the predictions, then we will most likely, if we don't act now, lose much more of these. For the economy, they are very vital, $9.9 trillion US dollars per year. So recently, last year, at the end of last year, there was actually the agreement by the international community through the United Nations for the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, which called for change in this also United Nations decade of environmental restoration. And these agreement framework set quite a lot of challenging tasks to be completed by the end of this decade. And so the first target is to actually get to close to zero loss of biodiversity by the end of this decade. So I say biodiversity, but this will much focus on corals. The framework is for all biodiversity at a global scale. We also, in this framework, the framework also targets to restore or be on the way for active restoration of 30% of all degraded habitats. And this also includes the very vulnerable habitats, such as like coral. And 30% by the end of this decade supposed to be under active protection. So these numbers don't really mean anything if we actually don't try to put meaningful numbers to them, what is actually, how much this refers to corals. And we've tried to do this in a paper that is now submitted, where we estimate that the entire reef area in the world is about 350,000 square meter, of which 53,000 square meter are actually coral habitat. So coral habitat is defined as habitat where you have more than 1% coral or algae. So if we look at the corals and the coral cover over the last decades, you can see since the late 1990s, it has been declined, came up, recovered a little bit, and then declined in the last decade from 2009 to 2018 by 13.5%. In addition, the IPCC predicts that even under the most optimistic climate change scenario, which is 1.5 degree global warming, we still lose 70 to 90% of all corals. So what we have to do to keep in this framework, to keep the targets proposed in this framework? Well, at the moment, we estimate that we have actively protected about 2.5% of corals. If you look at the area at the moment, we estimate that we have about 14,000 square meter of live coral. So this means actually really area covered by live coral. And if we want to keep to the target set to the end of this decade, we have to restore 1,500 square kilometer of living coral cover to prevent the loss that we predict to occur till the end of this decade, and another about 1,000 square meter just to restore to the 30% that have been degraded in the past decades. So this doesn't really mean much because it's really hard for us to picture this. But if we translate this to a reef, about a square meter reef, then this would mean that we have to restore the size of about 3 tennis courts. To put this in numbers of corals, it would mean that we have to outplant till the end of this decade about 37 billion corals. And under the current cost of a coral outplant, which is about $15–16 with survival to 1 year, this would mean $0.6 trillion, which is 3 times the budget that was given to the framework at the global scale to cover all any biodiversity. So it clearly shows that at the moment we talk about prices that are way too expensive. We need to dramatically reduce this. And one of the ways is obviously automatization. So what are coral restoration methods? There's a variety of methods. Most commonly, people just break fragments. Corals are animals, but they behave very much to a plant seedling where you can take a cutting, you can transplant it to a different site and it will grow again. You can also do sexual reproduction, which is more challenging, and microfragmentation, where you just fragment again. It's asexual, but you try to get the coral to grow faster. Regardless of the method, you see there is quite some differences in the survival rates, and at the moment we don't really have a very efficient method. And this can be seen if we look at the coral restoration efforts at a global scale. So at the moment, the price for 1 hectare as of 2010 is about $400,000. Most of the projects are rather small scale, 100 square meter area. And they focused mostly on fast growing species. So there's a strong bias towards species that grow very fast. If we translate this to the terrestrial field, then at the scale that we're working at the moment is this backyard. But where we need to go if we want to have a meaningful impact is really to this industrial scale. And I'm not talking about monocultures, but just for the scale. So I'm trying now to make a business case for automatization and robots in coral restoration, because I want to get you all on board to help this effort to really try to make a change for these very important environments. So I'm going to look at cost, lead time, quality, and flexibility to assess a few different techniques. So if we look at growing corals, farming corals, we have 2 different approaches. We have a land-based approach where we grow them in shallow tanks. We have, some of you may have seen it down our tanks that we have at Seymour today in one of the tours. You can also do the same in the sea. So if we look at now prices, and this is a costing scheme that I've done where I compared prices. These are based on the US to look at their efficiency and how much they cost. So you can see here on this side, the land-based facility. This is the cost, how much it would cost you to grow a coral in a land-based facility. And it's about, in the US, if you cut down, if you ignore property cost for coastal property, which you would need to have a farm, but if you keep it simple, just as, I'm not saying these numbers are perfect, but just as a rough estimate, it's about $30 per coral, and that's very expensive. You can do it cheaper if you do, let's say, a rope nursery in the water, an ocean-based solution, but these often have the problem that they overgrow a lot. So you get a lot of algae that attach to the ropes, and then you have lots of cleaning efforts. And if you calculate the cleaning efforts into it, you can see that the prices are similar to a land-based facility. So what this means is you really have to understand what you're doing where to estimate what would be the final cost per coral. But overall, we agree, I think, all that from a cost perspective, from a lead time, yes, these techniques are applicable at the moment. They're all there, but they're just still much too expensive to make a difference. And the quality, well, this depends very much, in all of these approaches, where you work. What is the water quality that you work with, the reef quality that you work with, and so on. And the flexibility, it's also intermediate, because if you look at these, they often, rope nursery may be suited to one environment, but not work in another. And so there is not a one-fits-all method at the moment. One of the issues, one of the problems that we see with corals is that they, the countries that harbor most of the coral reef area are not the wealthiest countries. So a lot of these actually are occur in developing countries where funding is a real issue. So, coming up with very fancy high-tech solutions, you have to ask yourself, could developing countries afford these, and are these practical? Because if you give somebody a high-tech robot and they sit somewhere in the Indian Ocean on a lonely island and it breaks, the question is, how fast can they actually get it working again to make a difference? And if we look at Kenya, for example, and we do the same calculations, but just for Kenya, you can see that all of a sudden, even with cleaning efforts, the ocean-based coral gardening methods are better, just because the labor costs are dramatically cheaper, right? So if we look at these countries, we have to ask, is automatization the solution, or should we integrate the local stakeholders, where you also would have a social impact? I mean, ideally, it's probably hybrid. I'm not saying it's either one, but it's certainly a calculation that we need to take into it. And if we look at robotics, then at the moment, we are not very, very close to actually have meaningful robots that can help us to make a difference. I hope with all of your brains involved in this conference, we can soon change this. But at the moment, to be a little bit realistic, we're not that half a year away from a robot that will be able to outplant corals at scale. The cost, well, in the immediate perspective, it may be high, more applicable in developed countries. Hopefully, if it then, if there's a true pathway of automatization, it becomes cheaper and more applicable across. For the quality, that's really hard to say. Flexibility, I have to say that most of the solution, I go later into this, are very targeting very single solution, very single pathway. So there's not a robot like a humanoid robot that could replace me, go diving, take some corals, plant them out, then go to the desk and write up. So we don't have this one solution. Also, what we need to consider is, if we look at this graph, it shows actually wages in Kenya again, and the US, and also how when automatization makes sense and becomes available in Kenya. And this is an example taken from the furniture industry. And what you can see is that even in the furniture industry, automatization will make an impact by the mid of the next decade in Kenya. That's when the automatization all of a sudden becomes cheaper than the labor costs in Kenya. And this is something that we have to address, because then we passed for sure the global goals for biodiversity preservation set by the biodiversity framework. Now, if we look at outplanting, so these are a variety of different outplanting techniques that I've collected, where people reported how much the cost was associated to the outplanting. And you can see that even like you know, it's really broadly spread from very expensive to possibly applicable at a larger scale. But there's also a lot of variety, and the variety you can see here is this are indicated by the red circles for fragmentation and the triangles, blue triangles for sexual reproduction. It depends very much on the mode of reproduction that you're applying. So overall, there are some of the techniques, and some I tell you are still applied, that are very expensive and not very efficient. So if we only move towards the more efficient ways to outplant corals, we would already save a lot of money and effort. So again, these are all the lead time. These are all techniques that are available, but at the moment they are way too expensive if we really want to make an impact. The quality, as you can see on the dots, it depends very much where you work and what you do. And for the flexibility, some are very flexible, applicable to different environments, others are not. But to tell you where now your business niche is right there, because this line actually indicates when it's not possible to do the red line on the bottom, when it's not possible to do any further cost reduction by diving or having people involved. That's where you need to have a robot that can automatically distribute something, because a diver can physically, there's physical limitation how much a diver can outplant, even if the diver would go and just throw things onto the reef. And if this is your business niche, then this is us, your competition. So we developed some technologies here at KAUST, which we call Marite. It's a suite of technologies where it's not automated, no robots as yet, where we just basically try to build technologies to be more efficient, more effective, and more scalable in the outplanting. And these are some of the solutions that we came up with. We have these crates, and so these crates are just for aquaculture to have all the coral seedlings that you want to plant into the reef grown on one unit that you can easily move around and transport from one side to the other, that technically could also be picked up by a robot and transported along or be scanned or phenotyped. The arrangement on a frame like this, where everything is neatly positioned, is great for automatization, which we also had in mind for it. And so the trick is that we have these little tiles that the corals grow on. This is like a flower pot for corals. And we can screw these tiles onto the crates. And once they grow to a certain size, we can unscrew. And then we have what I call the reef nail, which is just this little hat, threaded hat, and a normal nail. And we can hammer this into the reef and then just take from the frame where we grow our corals on, with the corals now being attached to the tile, we can just screw it onto the reef. It's a very solid attachment. It now can grow out. So it's very simple. And we have also solutions to put this onto structures or even artificial walls, so we can populate jetties or any underwater structure with coral over time. And the neat trick, and how it's a little bit technophile, is that they actually are microchipped. So we can now identify the corals, and we can identify which coral performed well in a certain environment and which didn't. And this allows us to accumulate data and to guide us to have an adaptive management approach to make wise decisions and to drive down the cost, because we reduce mortality in our approach over time. So now evaluating our own method, the method is there. The cost, I still think we can work to tweak it a little bit to reduce the cost, but it's still cheaper than other methods. For the quality, we're still evaluating this in different environments to make a valid call on this, to see how good it is. We still have to wait for some data, but it's very flexible. So you can use this and screw this around, you can move it around, and you don't lose track because it's microchipped. And what we're currently working on is an app, because you have to imagine that a lot of people who do coral restoration do it, they're not highly trained people, they're just local stakeholders. And for them to keep records, to ask them to keep detailed records so we can do some scientific analysis, is not ideal. So making it as simple as possible for them to track everything is ideal. So when everybody has a mobile phone, so we have an app that can link to the ship reader. You can read the tile out, you know which coral it is. It opens up in your app. It tells you this coral came from this environment, was like this long in the nursery. Other clones of this fragment have performed so and so well in this and this habitats. And all of a sudden it can guide you what you're doing. You accumulate data. And over time, if you think of projects like Shusha, where you have 2 million corals, these are big data sets that will then allow us to dive in, to analyze them, run AIs over that, to make better prediction and to be more efficient in our outplanting. So overall, if we look at aquaculture and where there is room for robotics and automatization to enhance these pathways, we can see that obviously just having good inventory tools where we can like track everything that we're doing, and we can do AI guided management that I just mentioned is very valuable. One of the biggest issues is just reduced maintenance, right? So if you can find a way, a robot that can help you to clean, to maintain your tanks, to just put less labor into each coral fragment, you reduce the cost dramatically. Because if you look of running a facility, a land-based facility, the majority, around 70%, is labor costs. Obviously, you can also do automatic phenotyping. And this is where we also work from our side, work towards where instead of us having to go to experiments and to phenotype everything over time to see how is the coral growing, how fast is it growing, is it bleaching, do we see an indication of stress or disease, also to automate this. So have a system that then gives you an alarm, pay attention to this in this tank, corals are not growing as fast, which just guides you to be better at what you're doing. So we were among the first, I think we are the first who did actually a coral restoration targeted robot in the kingdom, not in the world, because in parallel, without us knowing from each other, the Australians used the same model, which is actually was developed for plants, to actually also use it for coral restoration purposes, in coral gardening purposes, to have like a little robot that can go over a coral and have with a sensor or make a photo, read out information that will then be given to us. If we look at globally, Foundry, and Scott from Foundry was just here earlier this year. He has this amazing system that he's working on, where it's also like a robot that can then move little frames around, read them out, phenotype them, and potentially even clean them. He has quite some interesting ideas how to use lasers and water jets for cleaning. Obviously, we have the Shusha, the Rescape Initiative, which has this a big coral nursery that they have to maintain. So when we planted, the reason for this large nursery was that we couldn't harvest all the corals at the small island where the coral restoration site will be, the Rescape will be. So it required this large nursery to produce enough stocks over time. But if you have these large nurseries, you have to really think of industrial workflows to make this happen. And this is where we then put in the frame, the crate idea, so you can move things at least a bit easier and eventually use robotics. But as you can see in this illustration, this is from one of the animations that the Shusha team produced, is these robot arms are cool, but there is a problem because you can see where it grabs in, there is no light. And so a lot of the problems that we faced building a robot was actually we have to stay in this very shallow space between the light and the corals. And the robot had to operate in this narrow space. So these are a lot of considerations that you have to make when you design robots for this field. There's ReefGen, and Manju from ReefGen was here as well earlier this year. Very interesting approach. They have this RV, it's still a remote controlled robot that then drills a hole and can put in a plug. We're actually talking to him at the moment to see, or to them to see if they can also use our plugs. So it integrates with our system. So the idea is really to get a standardized system, a modular system where different people can, develop their own solutions to make it better, to improve it over time. The Australians also have this idea of this Larvabot, which then you collect larvae when they spawn. I actually just last month was in the field collecting larvae for an experiment done here with Professor Raquel. So it's great, but it's, if you don't if you're not able to produce constantly larvae, this will be limited to once a year. So then you have to think of, like, are there ways to shift the spawning event, which we have a system here at KAUST under Professor Manuel Aranda, which I helped to also conceptualize, where we can do 12 different, we have 12 different chambers to do individual spawning events. So this eventually should allow you to produce larvae all year round. The question is then, is it ideal for the larvae to be produced year round? Because normally nature has a reason why it's timed for this one spot. So earlier this year, we did this exciting KAUST and Shusha funded workshop on the exploring the frontier of coral aquaculture, where we try to explore what are meaningful technologies to be produced to enhance our field of research and to make coral restoration more scalable for land-based facilities, as well as for in situ or hybrid nurseries, and then for outplanting and monitoring as well. So there's soon, I'm actually working hard on it, will be a report for this where it will also provide some guidance of what are the future directions that we should look into. And there is soon, again, and this might be interesting for you, a funding call by KAUST to finance innovative solutions for exactly these issues. And how KAUST is structured is that you have to have partners in developing countries. So I strongly suggest you to look into this, and it's a very exciting problem. It's really meant for R&D development for coral restoration. And by this, I go again back at the what your business plan for your project should include. Well, you want to be low cost to be really truly scalable. The lead time can't be too long because we're facing a problem that is very immediate. It's an emergency situation that we are in. If we look at really trying to make a difference to the end of this decade, we need to increase the quality, we need to increase resilience and survival. So we should not just bring out things that we expect to be, again, taken in the next heat wave. So there's a lot of science and research that needs to go in to how we enhance the populations to be more heat tolerant, more stress tolerant to future stresses. And what is very important in our field is flexibility, right? Don't cater to just one market. Try to develop solutions that are applicable across the world, also in developing countries, also in very remote island systems, because this is where corals occur. And so if we look at this, it may all seem impossible, but then if we look at the COVID crisis that we had in 2020, where people said, oh, it's going to take so long to develop vaccines and we can really face it. We put ourselves together and we managed through the crisis quite well. So I would argue strongly that the current climate crisis is a much bigger threat to humanity than the COVID crisis was. And to end this talk, and as the last speaker, probably this conference, with the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. So thank you so much for your attention. I think I'm in time, and I'm happy to take any questions. And again, thank you so much for letting me talk here and be part of this exciting conference.